You have already figured this out, but again, the first lecture of any unit is always the long one. So here we are in the long one. And we start this part of it by looking at subcutaneous mycoses. Subcutaneous mycoses are really any fungal infection that's going on in the dermis or hypodermis. And this is typically going to happen either because a person has introduced fungi into a wound, or because, well, actually that's pretty much it. And that can be several different things. It can be like someone has a cut, or more commonly, a person is working with plants that have thorns, and the thorns can break the skin and introduce fungi all the way through the epidermis into the deeper tissues. And so these would typically spread within the connective tissues of the dermis and hypodermis, and not necessarily get deeper. And later on, we will look at fungi that will cause systemic infections. So we'll get to that. The only specific cause of cutaneous mycosis I'm going to show you is Sporothrix schenkii. And it is famous for causing infections in gardeners who work with roses and anyone else who works with plants that have thorns, because this fungus will live in the environment on plants and everywhere else, and if a thorn punctures an animal, it gets to be in the animal. And so what you would see if this particular one infected something that poked you is a lesion that would form. A small painless bump would form in that location in most cases over a period of weeks or months. And then it would likely either be surrounded by other bumps that form very slowly and go away very slowly, or bumps that appear along the lymphatic vessels leading towards the trunk. And these will eventually, or they can eventually ulcerate. So there can be an open wound from these that penetrates all the way into the dermis or deeper. And if you see pictures of those, you'll see that that would be something very noticeable, and a person would definitely be seeking medical treatment at that point. In some cases, so where people have an immune deficiency, that's usually the cause, this can also become systemic. And when that happens, it causes the disseminated form, so it goes to other organ systems, not just the integument, and it attacks bones, joints, nerves. These are different examples, really depending on where the cells end up. And so someone with immunosuppression who gets a Sporothrix infection might come into a clinic with inflamed joints and skin lesions. And so we can treat people with these infections with antifungals, but that is a slow process requiring months of treatment. And in some cases, it's not a very successful thing where you'd have to go through multiple different antifungals to successfully treat it. So that's all I'm going to say about cutaneous mycosis. Just understand that we can't clearly put all the fungi into cutaneous or systemic or pneumonia. The thing is, a lot of these will infect whatever part of the body they can get into. But the cutaneous ones, typically, because of their lifestyle, they're going to get into the skin. Whereas the next few we're going to see, these are going to be inhaled. So their life cycle leads them to put spores in the air, and they infect people when we inhale them. But even though they're inhaled, they can go and cause disease in different organ systems. They can travel through the blood. And so you can see skin lesions that started with inhaled forms of these fungi. So it's never going to be obvious what caused a fungal skin lesion, and it's never going to be obvious what caused a fungal pneumonia. That's what I'm getting at. So there are 3 well-known fungi that cause systemic infections through the inhalation route, and these are geographically distinct. So knowing where a person has been will help you figure out whether these might be involved. So, for example, in the U.S. Southwest, in Arizona and California, Coccidioides species are very common, and they cause what's called valley fever, and we'll get to that. In the Mississippi River watershed, that's all the states whose water drains into the Mississippi River. Over there, we can find histoplasma and blastomyces, and those are a little bit different. But all of these, again, come in through the inhalation route and then can be disseminated through the bloodstream. And so all of these grow in the outdoor environment somewhere, and a person would be exposed to them, and that would lead to the disease. These are not pathogens that are going to spread from person to person. You just get them if you inhale them. And so what they have in common is the disease course, where there are a lot of asymptomatic infections. So there's a lot of evidence people have been exposed with no way of knowing it, other than antibodies appearing in their bloodstream later. The most common form of disease with actual symptoms and signs is a mild pneumonia. And that makes sense because people are inhaling these fungi. And so if we respond to the fungi in the lungs, that is pneumonia. And then in all of these cases, it can be much more severe. If a person can't control the pneumonia, that's when we see these fungi spreading through the blood to other parts of the body. And that could be bones, that can be joints, and that can be meninges. So these, in severe cases, can lead to fatal meningitis. And these, again, really do separate along healthy people versus immunosuppressed people. In most of these cases, healthy people are going to recover completely and won't need treatment, but people with immune deficiencies might need life-saving treatment. Another thing these all have in common is that to diagnose them, it requires a biopsy. It requires taking something out of the body to find the actual causative fungus under the microscope or using another test. And that's because they're so common in causing asymptomatic infections, you can't use an antibody test. If a person comes in and they're sick and you give them an antibody test for one of these fungi and it comes out positive, well, that could mean they were infected 5 years ago and something else is causing their current infection. So that pretty much brings together these 3. Another thing that brings together these 3 is their life plan. They are dimorphic, and that means they have different forms at different times. And so in the environment, they grow as hyphae. So they grow as hyphae and they form mycelia, and they spread on whatever they're able to eat. And then they make aerial spores. So they make reproductive spores. And that's what we inhale. And once they're in our lungs, they switch and start growing as yeasts. So they act as single-celled organisms once they're in the body. And that's the main reason we group them together, because these are historically seen as yeasts that we would find in the blood or in the tissues. So again, they are typically grouped together. So there are differences between these. So besides their geographic location, with Coccidioides in the southwest and the others in the Mississippi River watershed, Coccidioides is the most likely to cause symptomatic infections, and it is also the most common. So people in the southwest are likely to have been exposed to Coccidioides, and something like half of infections lead to pneumonia. So it is a common disease, not just a common infection. So that pneumonia, that flu-like pneumonia, is a thing lots of people will experience in the southwest. And in the Southwest, this specifically spreads during dry conditions because that's when dust will get kicked up and stay airborne for people to inhale. Whereas in the others would be often more dangerous during wet conditions, which increase the rate of fungal growth. So it's a little bit different. So histoplasma is associated with bird droppings and bat droppings. And so people will get exposed by exploring caves or working with birds. But healthy people are not likely to experience disease. They are likely to have an asymptomatic infection. And so again, that would show up later in an antibody test because they would have an immune response to it, but it would not give them any signs or symptoms that they would notice. But this can be very serious for people with damaged immune systems. So all of these can be. The one that is the hardest to treat and the most damaging is blastomyces. It is the most dangerous of these three. It's also the most rare. So this would be associated with soil, rotting wood, and there are outbreaks of this in some cases where it's just growing a lot in the environment. So for some reason, this is common in Wisconsin, and there have been outbreaks among people who are doing recreation in a river. And that's bad. Like I know this because some of my former students in Wisconsin had lost friends to these infections because of these outbreaks. And so what's known about this is that even some healthy young people will get disseminated infections. So what that looks like in this case, since there is an immune system fighting it, it doesn't look exactly like it would if an immunocompromised person had disseminated infection. Instead, what they're going to see is a fever and weight loss and powerful immune response leading to things like night sweats. And of course, they will also have pneumonia because that's how they originally got the disease. So these last two, histoplasma and blastomyces, these are the most likely to cause the disseminated infection. And so these are some pictures of skin lesions that a person got after inhaling these fungi. So these people are dealing with these disseminated infections, and they've had to seek medical treatment. So you can see this is a very deep ulcer. That's necrotic tissue, and this is looks like a fight between the skin and this fungus. But you would obviously seek medical attention if either of these things happened to you. So these are thought of as systemic fungal pathogens. They cause systemic diseases, and you should be aware of them. There are a lot of other fungi that cause systemic infections, and we are going to look at them. But those are all distinct from the previous three. We cannot group the others the same way, and that's partly because they will have different symptoms and signs, or they'll have a recognizable constellation of symptoms and signs, and some other reasons. So I had to re-record this and kind of update this, so I ended up with an unintentionally blank slide, and I apologize for that. A different infection is caused by Cryptococcus neoformans and Cryptococcus gattai. I don't know exactly how to pronounce that, and it doesn't matter. This is Cryptococcosis, and this is more of an urban disease because it infects pigeons and it grows in their droppings. This is not a very common illness, but with AIDS patients, it is common. So in urban situations, many people are exposed to low levels of pigeon droppings, but people with immunosuppression are at a lot of risk from Cryptococcus. And so get these two numbers. You don't need to memorize them, but 1/4 of all deadly fungal infections come from these two species. And a large fraction of people with AIDS would experience one of these infections. So it typically starts with a respiratory infection and a long incubation time. And then ultimately, the bloodstream infection leads to meningitis, and the meningitis is what's fatal, so infection of the meninges. And there are antifungal treatments, but we don't need to get into what they are. This is what it looks like in a capsule stain. So what you're seeing here are the individual cysts, I guess you'd call them, of the fungus. And this brown stuff is ink under the microscope. So you're looking at ink which is repelled by the polysaccharide capsule here. So this clear area around the cell is a polysaccharide capsule. And there you have it. So that capsule is a kind of virulence factor that prevents phagocytosis and makes it difficult for the immune system to recognize it. Also, any organism that's covered in carbohydrates is difficult to attack because a lot of our immune system is aimed at identifying proteins, not carbohydrates. So one of the weirder ones is Pneumocystis, which causes Pneumocystis pneumonia. This is incredibly common. People with AIDS have a high chance of experiencing pneumonia from this species every single year. So this used to cause a large fraction, like more than half of the deaths due to AIDS. And now we understand it better and can treat it. So, like I said, it's incredibly common. It's in everyone's lungs, but typically doesn't cause disease. So most children have been exposed to it. But most children don't have pneumonia, right? So we can treat it. It used to be thought of as a protist because it has a weird life cycle. Doesn't matter. And its species name changed. So what you'll see, I think on the previous slide I had that, PCP, Pseudomonas, PCP, Pneumocystis carinii pneumonia. Well, it's been renamed Pneumocystis girovesi, I don't know how they pronounce that, but clinicians still call it PCP for short. Another group of organisms, so not one species, but a larger group, something like a family or class of fungi, cause mucormycetes. And these are some kind of gross pictures, and the one on the next slide is much worse. This is a fast-moving, fatal, opportunistic infection. And several different fungi called, they're all from the same phylum, but I think that they're all within a smaller group. They're called Mucormycetes. And people who have significant dysfunction at the epithelia, so they either have acidosis or burn or complete immune dysfunction, they can get an overgrowth of this fungus. And it can penetrate deeper tissues. And that's what you're seeing here is a person has a deep tissue infection. And they've had to be surgically debrided and removed both the skin and layers of muscle to get to it, and they're seeing huge amounts of fungal growth. That is horrifying. I don't know if this person lived very long after this or not. But it begins with some kind of a skin infection that will spread, and this would be necrotic changes like gangrenous changes where the tissue just starts to die because it's being attacked and its blood supply is disrupted. So the only way to treat that would be removing tissue very quickly and using antifungal medications. If you see in a patient quickly spreading gangrene or tissue necrosis, it is important to have an idea of what's causing it, and because you'd use different drugs to treat bacterial gangrene versus fungal gangrene. Bacterial gangrene would be caused by Clostridium or Streptococcus, and these are gram-positive bacteria that you could attack with the penicillins or other antibiotics, whereas Mucormycetes would need powerful antifungals. So just works out that the worst picture in these slides is where I'm going to end this video, and that's the end of the fungi. We're going to move from here into protists, and there will be a short amount of protist biology and then a lot of different protist pathogens, and we'll go into some depth in several different protists, as you will see. So I'll see you there.